So two of the things that you pointed out as programming choices, one was that anything with Donald Trump or response to Donald Trump rated better. And so just every cable news outlet covered everything Trump did during his 2016 run. And then that became true, obviously, when he was president. And then the inverse of that was that if there was something kind of educational or scientific or deeper, then it would be less appealing or wouldn't rate as well. And so you wound up with like a bias towards Trump all the time and less about, for example, what a public health official or scientist was saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And initially, when the pandemic started, they are professional journalists and they kicked into gear just like they should. And they were trying to get the information they could from scientists and doctors and frontline workers, and developed a special. Dr. Zeke Emanuel was, on once a week to cover, focus on issues related to COVID. And after a number of weeks, they discovered that wasn't rating well. So then it got kind of, started on Monday, Tuesday, and then they pushed it to a Friday because that's a day that they don't care as much about ratings because that's for our own program, for MSNBC's or Last Word's own programming needs, that it wasn't as important. And then it slowly just kind of fizzled out and died. And it was because it wasn't rating well. And then you could see the coverage when they would do a COVID segment, it really was about just the politics. And they would have on science reporters or correspondents, but they were, pushing them, trying to get them to talk more about the politics than the actual science. And it was through a time when there were a lot, there's still lots of information coming out all the time about the virus and vaccines and what we know and what we don't know. And that all of that was, they would try to get to it if they could, or it just wasn't kind of the top line. It was something that was thrown in maybe as a, an afterthought. That all of that information really got pushed to the wayside, and they focused much more on the politics. And it was, the Trump attacking the blue state governors, or, what Trump, what dumb thing Trump said or didn't say or didn't do. It really focused on that. And I understand there's a time and a place for that, but it was just dominated everything.
That drove me crazy on the trail too, where it was always like Trump's stupid or inflammatory comment of the day. And then even like I'd be running for president in Iowa, New Hampshire, and they'd be like, Trump said this, what do you think of that? And I'm just like, are you kidding me?
Yeah, exactly.
Really?
Yeah. And that same idea was pervasive throughout and it was the last election cycle as well, the Democratic primary process. If there was a personality dispute, that got way more attention than any interesting policy conversation. And I think there were lots of interesting policy conversations we could have had, the ideas that you had being the start of it. But then, when it came down to the general and it was Biden versus Trump, almost every single, I know that they tried to focus on Biden when they could, but it always turned into a segment about Trump. They don't want to talk about anything that is negative towards Democrats because that was bad for the MSNBC audience. And the same thing, applied to the Democratic primaries as well. There just wasn't a full discussion that ultimately benefits everyone. So
I think I might have been part of that or non-part of that.
Yeah, I know. This is not exactly an unbiased audience I'm talking to right now.
No. I mean, again, like this to me is more of like a systemic
it
broadcast
for sure
problem.
is. And it, I saw it happen. I watched it in 2016. And so that, when everybody was, I'm sorry, when everyone was shocked that Hillary didn't do better than she did, I was frustrated because I was like, no, there were polling numbers out that showed, enthusiasm for her, that were concerning. And, that MSNBC wasn't covering that. So that liberal audience didn't necessarily.
Well, that's rough, like that there were actually some numbers that cut the other way that weren't covered. I mean, that's actually new to me, relatively speaking. Maybe everyone knows that already.
I was angry almost every day in those
Oh,
meetings
wow. Yeah.
through. I mean, it was not pleasant because I was at a point where I mean, I never really bite my tongue anyway, but I just could not believe that they were making decisions about, economic segments. And, oh, that's not going to, the day I gave my resignation, they canceled an economic segment because quota wasn't going to rate. And they filled it with some other, you know, not a serious segment. And I, between the pandemic and I frankly had issues with how they were covering the George Floyd stuff, the protests. Again, the way that they covered the protests, they wanted conflict, and they put the correspondents on the ground in a way that they even if nothing was happening, they wanted it to seem like something was happening. And if there was a car that was on fire, they're going to play that video over and over again. Meanwhile, 95% of the protests were peaceful. But I've been in the control room going back to 2015 and the Black Lives Matters protests then. People, they would monitor all of those protests. They'd have cameras and choppers, they're monitoring the protests. And unless it turned violent, they would not, quote, take it live. They wouldn't show that peaceful protest because nothing was happening, according to them. It was boring and it wouldn't make good TV. So that is a type of thing that kind of got to me through the George Floyd coverage. There were other elements. There were points about the election and election security. Those stories kept getting sidelined. They were not covering them. I was trying to get them to cover the issues. How are you going to have a safe election, with COVID? And, there were lots of groups working on it. It was really, really, really difficult to get them to cover that. There were opportunities when Trump went to Tulsa. There were opportunities to talk about some of the kind of painful history in this country. It would have been very easy to discuss the history in Tulsa and the Tulsa riots or Juneteenth and what is what is behind that and why it's so meaningful to the African American community. And you can trace the anger from those events to George Floyd. It would have been it wouldn't have taken very long at all. But there was a history there that I didn't know, and I know a lot of smart people and journalists didn't know, and it was a perfect opportunity to share that, and it helps the nation understand what is happening other than just people are angry and looting the local Walmarts.
One thing that a producer, a friend of yours, said that really seemed telling was, look, people come to us for comfort. Like, they don't see us as the news. I thought that was incredible. And there is something fundamental about two different purposes. One would be, I'm going to edify and inform, and so I'm going to serve you some stuff that might be not that scintillating. It might be kind of boring. It's like broccoli as programming. And then there's this other direction that it's like, I'm entertainment. Like, I'm going to have certain patter and rhythm and characters and something that you can cheer or boo.
Right. Yeah. And that was in one of our planning meetings. So that was a senior producer. And it's definitely something that, stood out and something I remembered, because you're abdicating your role as a journalist, and it's confusing because otherwise it kind of looks like a newscast. You have an anchor sitting at a desk with the TV over his shoulder, and you're covering things that are in the news. And so the audience, I realize that there's an awareness that MSNBC is more opinionated than the straight 6 p.m. newscast, but at the same time, they play it both ways. So that's what I think is really dangerous, when it looks like something that should be reliable, but it isn't really, then that's to me where the problem comes in.
I'm pretty sure news is in the name somewhere. There's somewhere in there, like there's the word news. Thank you for listening in. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you did, please do subscribe to Yang Speaks and click on notifications so we can let you know every time we have a new episode.